On Monday, the annual World Happiness Report was released as South Africans were in the midst of a national shutdown initiated by the economic freedom fighters. The report is based on the ranking of 137 countries based on factors such as income, health, freedom, generosity, and the absence of corruption. Dr. Yolande Steenkamp is a senior researcher at the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute at the University of Pretoria and joins us now to unpack these issues. Yolande, appreciate your time this afternoon. Let's talk about the World Happiness Report and how it is actually compiled.
Hi, Hugo. Yes, the World Happiness Report is a flagship publication of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN. And that is a global network working closely with the United Nations, working with knowledge institutions in order to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. That should say that the World Happiness Report really should be understood as part of a conversation on sustainable development. And so if we think of the development agenda such as the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda, or the African Union 2063 Agenda, the Africa we want, or our own National Development Plan, as sort of the means to the end, then happiness, even though it may seem like quite a superficial construct, but well-being, the sense of well-being of citizens is the end that we're all striving for.
Well let's break it down for the average person,
Sure.
like myself. What are some of those elements that contribute to our happiness?
So let's begin by saying that happiness is a very subjective experience. And therefore, in working out the data for this report, they don't look at factors such as economic wealth or education, etc. They ask people whether they feel happy. They do this by what they call a Cantrell report.
Yeah.
There's a ladder of 10 steps. So imagine your own life, your best possible life as the very top step, your worst possible life as the lowest step, and then the question, your current life, where do you think you find yourself? But then after that data is gathered, and this is how the report is produced, after that, they then try to explain and understand the results that they received. And then we begin to look at things like social support. The social support that people feel they have make a huge impact. I would say probably the greatest impact in whether people report themselves as being fulfilled and being happy. Then things like the GDP of a country, the health, both physical health, but also when you speak about happiness, very importantly, mental health.
Right, yeah.
And then things like, interestingly, generosity, the ability of people to engage in altruistic acts, things like that. So they call this the 6 explanatory factors for world happiness.
Now, South Africa ranks at a lowly 137. How did we manage to achieve that?
Yes, number 85 out of 137.
85, beg your pardon, 85 out of 137 countries, correct?
That's right. And then this year being the third ranked country out of all the African countries. So how did we achieve that? So they gathered this data by this survey that I explained. And they gather a statistically representative sample from all the nations that are involved. And this is the data that come from South Africans themselves, essentially. And then, of course, one might ask the question, as being South Africans ourselves and being faced, I think, by challenges that are so real at the moment, the level of corruption in the country, the persistent load shedding, the rolling blackouts that we've been experiencing, etc., and crime, definitely. Whether this is accurate, are we really, in terms of the continent, the third happiest country?
I'm obviously baffled, because if we go back and look at the last 3 years, we've had COVID, where hundreds of thousands of people were laid off work, where hundreds of thousands of people died during the pandemic. We look at the looting that occurred in the KZN, and obviously the businesses that were affected by that, the flooding that occurred in the KZN repeatedly, a number of people that have died. We take a look at statistics around crime, gender-based violence, reports of anything between 12 and 13,000 women, primarily, being abused in a quarter, right? And we are the third happiest country on the continent. It sounds almost too good to be true, if you will.
So there's something really interesting about what you're pointing out, and that is that research has shown that in a crisis situation, altruistic acts actually increase. And it may be because of the energy that is released, the desire to act, something must be done, and therefore people become more generous, either by making a donation, by volunteering their time, by helping a stranger. And furthermore, this research shows that not only the people engaging in these acts of altruism, also the beneficiaries of these acts, but interestingly, even just the observers, to see, and you mentioned gift of the givers, just to observe an altruistic act. An altruistic act is something that is done for another person at no benefit to the self. That actually, just observing that, has a positive impact on the happiness of an individual.
So it then forces the question to ask about countries where there is war, or there are greater catastrophes and calamities than South Africa. Should they, if we use the altruism scale, for instance, or the altruism example as a measure, should they not be happier? Should they not be above us? On the contrary, I'd like to imagine that if you went into the Horn of Africa, where millions have been displaced, hundreds of thousands have died because of flooding, etc., and all that's happening with global warming.
Yes, so obviously with something like that, there are so many factors that should be taken into account. But just specifically to your point, there's something about Africa that should be pointed out, and that was pointed out in a previous World Happiness Report. I believe it was 2017, possibly. And that is that the incredible resilience that people from the African continent in particular show in much less than perfect circumstances, right? To give a sense of support to one another in our communities, and to somehow make it through and carry each other. And also happiness, there's a large comparative factor with happiness in determining or answering the question, do I have enough? How do I feel? There's always the question, who do I compare myself to when I answer that question, which is why it is so subjective. If I compare myself to the average citizen of the Northern European countries, and they typically come out at the very top of the World Happiness Report rankings, if I compare myself with them, then maybe I'll think that, my life is just miserable. But given the country that we're in, there may be gratitude given who I end up comparing myself to.
And that raises the question, Yolande, are children a part of this report? When they compile the report, do they speak to children?
I'm actually not sure. So they gather data from around 100,000 recipients each year. The specific report was based on an average of the last 3 years. Whether they specifically spoke to children, I'm not too sure, although that's such a significant point because of the huge youth population on the entire continent.
Not only that, but you talk about comparing those from the north with those of us on the continent, right? Now, many of us ran around without shoes as little kids, potentially with torn clothing or whatever it is, Many of us were poor, but that's all we knew. But we were still happy, right? Now, 20 years later or 30 years later, when you compare yourself now, your station now, to maybe 20 or 30 years prior, when you were happy, but that which makes you happy now certainly is vastly different from what would have made you happier then.
Exactly. And also, again, depending on the situation that I now currently find myself in, as opposed to 20 years ago, maybe my position has changed to such an extent that I was able to accumulate a lot of material things. but maybe my relationships have suffered, and then the subjective happiness might actually be very lower. I think there's a very important point here that we, I think, need to hear from this report that just rises up, and that is the value of our commitments as a society, a commitment to virtue, a commitment to the humanity of the other, because these are actually the things, science shows, that give us a sense of fulfillment, and not the loud voices that may be shouting all around us, buy this, buy that, be in opposition to this, you know. And that science shows these are not actually the things that play such a huge role in contributing to a sense of well-being as one might think.
Now, this isn't part of the report, but you raise the issue of humanity, and it begs a question, and I don't know if you have the answer for this, Yolande, but we talked about Gift of the Givers and the phenomenal work that they've been doing all across the country, and the fact that they flew out to Turkey a few weeks ago, actually, to assist following those absolutely devastating earthquakes. But only recently, we've had incredible flooding in Mozambique and Malawi, where hundreds of people have lost their lives. In fact, the Malawian government, I think actually it was UNICEF that said a few days ago that it is possible that death toll could rise to 1,000. Do you get the sense that as Africans, humanity, or Ubuntu, as we like to call it, extends beyond our borders, right? Do we, at the first instance, jump across to Malawi and say, you know, let's go out and help the Malawians because of this disaster? Do we hurtle across the provinces to KZN because there's been a massive flooding? Do we go to the Western Cape because there have been fires that have been destroying some of the homes there?
I think that it does. I think we see that from many of our actions. But to the extent that it doesn't happen, in the interest of the well-being of the continent, it should happen. That is where our commitment should lie, because that is the part that is indicated as the path of our well-being.
Now, let's take a look at this report. This report is done, it is compiled. Do governments actually look at it? Do ministries, do departments take a look and say, okay, look, let's have a look at the happiness report. We're ranked 3rd, so we're happy, or, you know, we're number 137.
Right.
What do we need to improve?
Right. They actually do. Not all countries to the same extent, but many countries see this as sort of an indicator that they are moving in the right direction in their countries. And, of course, this can also influence policy making, etc., in order to address the issues that deter from people's happiness.
Now, not a lot of this is obviously related to the SDGs that we speak of. What is the communication then, certainly between the UN and various governments on the fulfillment of the SDGs, particularly when reports such as these are then delivered?
There are formalized and structured ways of communication between the UN and various countries. There's also high-level political forums. There's a number of bodies. I think perhaps the more important question to ask is how does a report such as this, at a lower level, enable action? What I mean by that, for instance, later this year in May, several of the other Sustainable Development Solutions Network country and regional managers from the African continent will travel to South Africa, and we will engage with one another. We did the same in Kigali last year. And, you know, opportunities like that is great for engaging with the report and seeing what needs to be communicated from the African continent, and send that to the global secretariat that we have access to.
Yolande, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Hugo.
Dr. Yolande Steenkamp is a senior researcher at the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute at the University of Pretoria.